What if some of the most catastrophic decisions in modern history were made under the influence? Adolf Hitler, one of history's most reviled figures, a dictator whose regime brought war to the world and death to millions. But beneath the carefully curated image of a teetotal vegetarian visionary, the reality was far more chaotic and far more chemically altered. Throughout the Second World War, Hitler was regularly injected, dosed, and drugged, not just with vitamins, but with powerful stimulants, opioids, and cocaine. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, kept meticulous records of a medical regime that included more than 70 different substances, many now classified as narcotics or performance-enhancing drugs. In this film, we'll explore how Hitler's increasing dependence on drugs, especially cocaine, may have shaped his mind, influenced his behaviour, and played a hidden role in the rise and the fall of the Third Reich. From the doctor's injections behind closed doors to the meth-fueled marches of German soldiers across Europe, this is a story of war, addiction, and delusion. This is High Hitler, drugs, delusion, and the downfall of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with health. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he promoted clean living and public fitness. Nazi propaganda painted him as the physical embodiment of willpower, a man of iron discipline. But privately, Hitler was falling apart. By the mid-1930s, he was plagued with chronic digestive issues, insomnia, skin conditions, and frequent bouts of exhaustion. He suffered from stomach cramps, severe flatulence, and an uncontrollable tremor in his left hand, symptoms that would only worsen with time. Enter Dr. Theodor Morell. Morell was a well-connected Berlin physician who specialised in unconventional treatments, vitamin injections, hormone therapies, so-called miracle remedies. When he was summoned to treat Hitler's intestinal discomfort in 1936, he quickly became the dictator's most trusted medical advisor. Within days, Hitler's condition improved, or so he believed. Morell prescribed a cocktail of live bacteria cultures and digestive enzymes. Hitler, delighted with the results, appointed him as his personal physician. From that moment on, Morell never left his side. Morell's treatments grew more frequent and more intense. He began administering daily injections, at first just vitamins and laxatives. But as the years went on, the syringes contained far more potent substances. Among the first controlled drugs introduced into Hitler's regime, cocaine-based eye and nasal drops. Prescribed initially to treat sinus infections and eye strain, they had a secondary effect: stimulation, alertness, euphoria. At the time, cocaine was widely used in medicine, even in commercial products. But for Hitler, what began as therapeutic soon became habitual. By the late 1930s, Hitler was requesting these treatments regularly, believing they gave him clarity, energy, and strength. And Morell, eager to maintain his place in the Führer's inner circle, gave him whatever he asked for. To the outside world, Hitler was projected as an image of discipline, but inside the Reich Chancellery, he was already descending into pharmaceutical dependence. The myth of a clean living leader was cracking, and the man who once scorned drugs would soon become one of history's most heavily medicated figures. By the time World War II had begun, Adolf Hitler was no longer functioning without chemical assistance. His dependence had grown quietly but steadily. Dr. Morell, now with almost unlimited access to the Führer, kept detailed notes of every injection, every pill, and every dose. In these records, we find a staggering list of substances. Over 70 different compounds, stimulants, sedatives, opioids, hormones, and yes, cocaine. Hitler's daily cocktail would include methamphetamine in the form of Pervitin, a drug handed out to soldiers but also used to elevate his energy and mood. Oxycodone, then marketed as a Eucadol, a powerful opiate described as a supermorphine, used when his pain became unbearable. Cocaine eye nasal drops, used frequently to relieve sinus pressure and keep him alert. Barbiturates to help him sleep, and stimulants to jolt him awake just hours later. Injections were often administered multiple times a day, sometimes as many as 3 or 4. And while Hitler believed that these were vitamin boosts or harmless tonics, many of them were highly addictive, mind-altering substances. Witnesses inside the Reich noticed the change. His personal staff reported increasing irritability, wild mood swings, and frenzied monologues that would stretch for hours. His speeches, once carefully composed, became erratic, his gestures more twitchy, his emotions harder to control. One general described him as a man in a glass case, isolated, sweaty and trembling. Hitler had begun referring to Morale's injections as his Vita Molten, a made-up word combining vitality and multivitamin, but he was not a wellness regime. This was a full-blown pharmaceutical dependency. Morale, for his part, kept feeding the habit. Whether out of loyalty, ignorance or ambition, he continued to increase the dosage and the frequency. At one point, Hitler was receiving a mixture that combined caffeine, cocaine, morphine derivatives, animal hormones, and belladonna, a hallucinogen. Hitler still appeared as the powerful commander of a ruthless empire, but behind the curtain, he was increasingly unstable, driven by paranoia, propped up by pills, and unable to function without chemical aid. The Führer wasn't just leading the war, he was waging one inside his own bloodstream. Hitler's chemical dependence didn't just affect his body, it shaped the fate of nations. As the war escalated, so did his drug intake, and as his health declined, his grasp of reality slipped further away. Military decisions were increasingly made not through strategy or logic, but during late-night tirades under the influence of morphine derivatives and stimulants. According to transcripts from Nazi officials, Hitler's thinking became erratic, wild overconfidence one day, crushing despair the next. He dismissed the advice of seasoned generals, he micromanaged battles from hundreds of miles away. Some of the most baffling commands, like refusing to allow troops to retreat at Stalingrad, coincided with documented periods of intense drug use. It's impossible to know how much influence the drugs had, but those close to him were alarmed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel described a man no longer capable of reasoned discussion. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, later wrote that Hitler's decisions had become completely divorced from military reality. Meanwhile, Dr. Morale also treated him for a growing list of ailments: collapsing veins, inflamed intestines, insomnia, high blood pressure, and tremors so severe that they had to hide his left hand during public appearances. The man who once held Europe in his grip was now a jittery, pale figure, slouched in his chair, doped and dozing, then suddenly manic and barking orders. His drug use began to mirror that of a patient spiralling through withdrawal and redosing, a cycle of collapse and revival. Yet, even though his decisions became more disastrous, the inner circle stayed silent. Morale remained untouchable. Hitler trusted him completely, to a fault. One SS officer later said, "The doctor kept him standing, but at what cost?" By 1944, Hitler was visibly falling apart, but the delusions kept growing. He believed in miracle weapons, phantom divisions, and impossible victories. The drugs didn't just prop him up, they helped him build a fantasy world that consumed the Reich. And soon, that world would begin to collapse. By the end of the war, Adolf Hitler was a shell of a man who once electrified crowds with his speeches and led invasions across Europe. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in from all sides, Hitler withdrew, physically and psychologically, into the Führer bunker beneath Berlin. His physical deterioration was stark. His complexion was grey, his posture stooped, his left hand trembling violently, his right leg dragged. He could barely walk without assistance. His voice lost its power, and the drugs, the daily lifeline, were becoming less effective. By this point, supplies were running low. Dr. Morale's treatments became inconsistent. Medical records suggest Hitler was undergoing the beginnings of withdrawal. Sleeplessness, digestive collapse, paranoia, and deep depression. Morale attempted to maintain the regimen using whatever was left: injections of animal glands, caffeine, glucose, and remnants of Pervitin. But the more Morale tried, the less it worked. Hitler became increasingly distrustful even of Morale. He began accusing him of incompetence. One day in 1945, he abruptly dismissed him from the bunker. The man who had kept Hitler standing for nearly a decade was now thrown aside. Hitler, drug-deprived and spiralling, shut himself away from his generals, obsessing over maps and phantom armies that no longer existed. His mood swung violently from rage to catatonia. He barely ate, he barely slept, he barely spoke, and in those final days, it's possible he was experiencing full withdrawal symptoms: headaches, back pain, hallucinations, delusional thinking. When Soviet troops finally reached Berlin, Hitler was no longer leading an empire. He was a broken man in a bunker, married to a fantasy and sustained by ghosts. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life by suicide. At his side, Eva Braun, in his bloodstream, the lingering traces of opioids, stimulants, and sedatives. The regime he built was collapsing just as he had, from the inside out, and in the wreckage of the Third Reich, one question lingered: how much of its downfall was written not just in ideology and arrogance, but in addiction? After the fall of Berlin, Dr. Theodor Morell was captured by American forces. He was not tried at Nuremberg, nor was he executed. In fact, many of his contemporaries dismissed him as a joke, the quack of the Reich. But his notes, found among the wreckage of the Führer bunker, told a different story. Over 1,100 pages of medical records documented Hitler's physical decline and the extraordinary pharmaceutical cocktail that sustained him. These records revealed that Morell had given Hitler over 800 injections in just a few years, dozens of narcotics and hormones, and regular doses of cocaine, both topically and possibly internally. Historians later debated, was Morell deliberately drugging the dictator, or was he just in over his head, catering to a hypochondriac tyrant? Morell never stood trial. He died in 1948, overweight, disgraced, and largely forgotten. But his role in the war's unfolding and Hitler's deterioration remains a dark footnote in history. Some scholars argue that the drugs didn't create the monster, they merely dulled or heightened what was already there. Others see a clear trajectory, a man increasingly driven by paranoia, detached from reality, and unable to process military failure. Hitler's drug use challenges the myth of the rational, calculating dictator. It raises uncomfortable questions about the role of addiction, illness, and mental instability in shaping the fate of millions. Even today, the image of Hitler as a man shaking in his bunker, feverish, hunched, drugged, clashes with the monstrous iconography he cultivated. The master of propaganda undone by a private regime of injections and powders. And yet, that contradiction is part of the truth. The dictator wasn't just defeated on the battlefield, he was also undone by delusion, denial, and dependency, a puppet of power propped up by painkillers and promises. The drugs didn't redeem him, they did not excuse him, but they did reveal something. Even the most feared men in history are, in the end, flesh and bone, vulnerable to decay, and haunted by their own collapse. Adolf Hitler's story has been told countless times as a cautionary tale of tyranny, fanaticism, and the horrors of war. But rarely do we focus on the chemicals that sustained him, on the impact those substances had on his body, mind, and decisions. Among them, cocaine stands out. It was given freely, almost casually, by Dr. Morell, first for minor throat issues, then as an eye treatment, and likely later as a mood enhancer. Cocaine was already being used across the Nazi leadership. Luftwaffe pilots were given Pervitin, pilot's chocolate, to keep flying through exhaustion, but in Hitler's case, cocaine came to symbolise more than a medicine. It fed into the myth they had constructed. The man who never wavered, never tired, never aged. Cocaine amplified his confidence, blunted fatigue, masked pain, but it also reinforced the delusion of invincibility. The cult around Hitler depended on his image of the tireless leader, always alert, always in control. Drugs made that illusion possible, even as they slowly destroyed him, and that illusion had consequences. As he clung to power, Hitler demanded absolute obedience, even when slipping further into a fog of narcotics. He made disastrous military calls, rejected diplomacy, and placed blind faith in imaginary counterattacks. His physical collapse paralleled the crumbling of the Third Reich. By the end, the man in the bunker bore no resemblance to the dictator who'd mesmerized a nation. Hitler had become a prisoner of his own myths and of the chemicals that had helped sustain it. Cocaine didn't make him a monster, but it helped him believe he was more than a man. And in that belief, in that toxic delusional confidence, lay part of the madness that drove the world to war. We often think of history as shaped by ideologies, armies, and leaders, but sometimes it's shaped by syringe, pills, and powders. Behind the speeches and the swastikas, behind the parades and the propaganda, was a man collapsing from within. And among the ashes of history, one thrilling truth remains. The Third Reich didn't just fall from bombs and bullets. It fell in part from a little brass vial and the myth of a man who thought he could never fall.